Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Kev Pearce, who's going to talk about some of the old epic stories from the cybersecurity trenches. Cheers, Kev.
Thank you, Simon. Right, the first thing I'll warn you is I haven't actually timed this, so it might be 10 minutes, it might be 10 hours. I don't quite know how this is going to go. But as I'm talking about security, there's a couple of conventions I have to follow. One is I never give away my full name, so I always have to put X's up there. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tell a few stories, true stories, about some of the incidents that have happened in the cybersecurity world. So specifically, if I can make it work, I'm going to talk about 3 people. Now, if anyone's heard of any of those, you've probably heard of Jennifer Lawrence, but I'm talking about more of her as a victim rather than as a hacker, although what she does in her spare time, I don't know. Going to start off with Terry Childs. Anyone heard of Terry Childs? Yeah. Okay, one person, good. So someone will learn something. I'm going to touch on Christina, and you'll see why when I get there. And if there's time, like I say, I haven't timed this, I'm going to talk a little bit about me as well, but that's kind of greyed out a little bit. So I'm going to start with Terry Childs. Now, Terry Childs was a sysadmin. He worked at the San Francisco District Authority, so City Council for us in the UK. And he was quite a smart chap. He ran the city's what they called fiber WAN network, and that was a name he kind of nicknamed and gave it. Quite a smart chap. He was a Cisco CCIE, so that's the highest level of Cisco certification. To get a CCIE, you have to sit a 3-level exam in Brussels, which is a practical exam full of boxes, and you've got to make it all work in 8 hours. So it's pretty heavy-going stuff. There's only about, I think there's now about 50, 60,000 CCIEs in the world, and he was number 14,000, so quite a smart chap. He liked his job, he liked his work, he was slightly obsessive with his work. When he built the fiber WAN network, not only did he give it a name, he also applied for a copyright, because the design of this network that he built was so good and so grand that he filed it under the category technical artistry. Now, I didn't even know that existed, but apparently it does, and you can file a copyright under it. So this was a large, dynamic MPLS network that ran most of San Francisco. So everything from the emergency 911 system, it ran what they call the 311, which is effectively phoning the council to complain about stuff. And there was a lot of elements of emergency services and civil networks, so things like traffic light systems were also linked off of this. So it was a fairly sizable network, and he was very proud of his network that he ran. But he got himself into a position where he wanted to protect his network, and it very much became his network. It was very complicated. A lot of people have argued since that it was actually overcomplicated, deliberately so that he was the only one who knew how to run it, and he was the only one who could look after it. He got into a position where only he knew what the configs were, only he knew the full complexity of it, but most importantly of all, only he knew the passwords to all of these routers. Just him. Now, you'd worry slightly at that in any organization, but in San Francisco, they didn't worry too much because he ran it, it was his job, and they kind of let him do it. There's a couple of quotes here that came up in the later court case, which I'm going to talk about in a second. He was not a people person. That's an actual quote by his boss within San Francisco. And another quote from his boss was, he has a bad temper. So there's a few telltale signs there from any boss hiring somebody that might be a bad thing to see on a CV. Just like to throw in at this point, Osirium, who I work for, we are hiring at the moment. So I'm going to be plugging away all the way through this that we are hiring for some jobs at the moment. Certainly not 2 things that I like to see on a CV. So this was the before. This was Terry when he was in his moderately controlled stage. Then something happened within San Francisco. One of his colleagues got promoted. Now, at a time where they all just kind of left each other to get on with their jobs, his colleague got promoted, and her first job was to audit his network. So she dived straight into what these passwords were and how well it was being managed and how many people looked after it. And obviously he didn't like that, so things started to get a little bit tricky at this point. So when this audit first kicked off, there was a bit of an incident. he was accused of threatening her. She had to lock herself in a comms room. She wouldn't come out until he deleted the pictures on his phone that he took of her. A few very strange things kind of going on at the time. I don't quite know about that. This is almost a direct quote from one of the legal papers, that there was a 2-week period that was a bit hazy, that they don't really know what happened within that 2-week period. But at the end of it, the city officials basically wanted nothing to do with him anymore, and they demanded that he hand over the usernames and passwords to all of these routers. So let alone understanding how it works or the configs or the complexity, they just wanted the credentials for their network and their kit. He refused. He refused on the grounds that if he were to give them the usernames and passwords, he would be infringing San Francisco's own IT policy. Because the IT policy states that nobody should have a username or password to manage a system for which they are not capable, skilled, or trained to look after. And of course, he was the only one that could run it. So why would he give the passwords to anybody else? He then got suspended for insubordination, funnily enough. And this is when it all started to go a little bit downhill for Mr. Childs. There was a bit of a rumour that at one point he did hand over some passwords, but he didn't tell him what the usernames were. Just to wind him up a little bit, just to keep him going. Then, again, a few weeks later, when things were a little bit hazy, he got arrested, later in 2008 this is. He was arrested on 4 counts of computer tampering, was the official line, and 1 alleged count, which was later dropped, of obstructing emergency services, because there'd been an issue with the network that had taken out a traffic light system which was normally controlled to allow ambulances through. So they hadn't allowed the ambulance to go through a red light or change the lights, so they were accusing him of affecting the emergency services from doing their job. It was later dropped, but one of the things with this case is there was a lot of strange things that got embellished and changed throughout the story. So it is quite a lengthy story, but I'm trying to stick to some of the facts. So he was taken to a court and arrested, and the judge set bail at $5 million. Now, the standard bail for murder in the US is $1 million, and his bail was set at 5. And the reason they thought that was because if they let him walk out that courtroom, he would immediately go and just down the network and down everything, because he had all the access to get all the routers, and they wanted to make sure that he didn't have access. So the way they did that was set bail at $5 million. His lawyers later put in a separate appeal just on the amount of bail, which is very rare within the legal system to go to that sort of expense, and it was denied. So a separate appeal just for the figure of the bail, and it was denied, and it remained at $5 million. Part of the story carries on that the San Francisco government, or the San Francisco District Authority, was so desperate to get these passwords. At one point, he said he would only give the passwords to the mayor if the mayor came down to the prison cell on his knees and begged for them and pleaded for these passwords, which the mayor did because he was told to, because they needed these passwords. And I think that's where he allegedly gave them passwords and not usernames, just as a bit of a poke at them. I don't think he liked the mayor very much. So yeah, he was having a bit of fun with them at the same time, which is a bit strange, but there you go. It carried on. It was claimed in some of the court papers that he'd booby-trapped the network. Now, how do you booby-trap a network? Well, they claimed that he'd configured a lot of the routers and not saved the running config to the non-volatile memory. So if you tried to reboot one of the routers, it would come back up with no config. Now that had 2 implications. One, that was you couldn't shut it down and do anything with it in any way, shape or form. The other problem there is that you couldn't perform any of the password reset procedures to put a new password in, because part of doing that password reset procedure involves rebooting the router, and you'd lose the config. So they were in a bit of a situation there. So this was classic the network. It's also alleged, and I find this bit quite amusing for the way lawyers think of things and worry about IT. They discovered a whole load of other usernames and passwords in Childs' house that he had in his possession, and these were submitted as evidence in the court. Now, in the court, all of the evidence is public, and it's public information, and it's all publicly presented in the courthouse for anyone to go and view outside of the actual court hearing. And they produced a list of usernames and passwords that weren't redacted, that were all fully readable in clear text in the courthouse, and they put them up on display as one of the articles of evidence. Okay, that was the lawyers thinking of all this, just throw as much as it was possible. Of course, they hadn't changed any of these passwords, and most of them worked, and a lot of them were VPN passwords, so people could get in remotely with somebody's credentials. So, it kind of story rolls on a little bit here. Lawyers, eh? So what happened then? So on the 27th of April 2010, he finally went to court. He was found guilty by a jury on one count in the end of felony network tampering. Now, I don't know the American justice system that well, but a felony to me is a fairly serious offence. But felony network tampering, slightly changed expression. But he got 4 years. 4 years in prison for not giving up passwords on that network. At this point, because of the $5 million bail, which naturally he couldn't raise, he'd already served 755 days in prison before it even went to court. So he'd served, whatever that is, a good 2-year chunk of the sentence already. He was also ordered to pay $900,000 to foot the bill of regaining control of the network. Now, I don't know about you, but I can do a password reset on a Cisco router, and it doesn't cost $900,000 worth of consultancy to do that. So whoever got that job was winging it a little bit, I think. And it was to regain the control of, and this is quite poignant, regain the control of the city's network. They no longer called it the fiber WAN because that was Terry Childs' copyright. And they couldn't breach copyright by calling it the fiber WAN anymore. So they just called it the city's network from this point. They then added $600,000 in court costs on top. So that made a nice round $1.5 million that he had to pay for the mop-up to his crimes. He was eventually released in May 2011. And then in October 2013, and I had a bit of fun with my spacing on the slide here, so I've got to bring this through like that. In October 2013, he filed another appeal against the $1.5 million bill that he had to pay, and that was upheld or affirmed by the court. That still stands today. He still owes San Francisco $1.5 million. I'm not quite sure what the payment scheme on that would be, but certainly on his salary or whatever he's going to be earning now. But yeah, that was upheld. So he still now owes them, after his prison sentence, $1.5 million. And this is him. This is quite a famous picture of him in his orange jumpsuit from the prison when he was taken into court, behind this blue box. It's one of the only shots of, clear, decent shots of Terry Childs himself. Doesn't look too happy. Looks like your typical sysadmin, really, I think. Not your typical hacker. How are we doing for time? There's a lot of other things that kind of happened through this story. It turned out afterwards that it wasn't the first time he'd been to prison. He'd been to prison in the past for aggravated burglary when he was a teenager, for which he got 4 years for as well. So he's got a bit of a history. Yeah, he's still got this job and he was still running the whole San Francisco network. So yeah, something's slightly amiss there. But anyway, that's Terry Childs. By all means, look him up. Normally you'd change the names to protect the innocent. He was guilty, so I've named him. That's fair enough. So yeah, read up on him if you want to and see some more of the amusing statements that the lawyers made in court, because some of them are crackers. So I'm now going to talk about something slightly different. Slightly shorter story, this one. So the Apple iCloud hack that happened, was it 2013? 2014, early 2014, can't quite remember. Basically, poor old or young Jennifer Lawrence. I would like to make the statement that other hacked actresses are available, because she wasn't the only one. There were many other accounts that got hacked in this. But when we say hacked, what do we actually mean? They didn't hack Apple, they didn't hack iCloud. What they did was brute forced her password. They guessed her password into her account. Well, anyone that writes software, anyone that has anything to do with security, knows that there are many, many ways that you can stop brute forcing a passwords applied. The difference here is that all of these brute force attacks were done over the API into iCloud. Now that made things slightly different. There was a little bit more of a challenge for them to protect it there. So some of the ways we would normally protect against this kind of thing, there's a kind of easy fixes you can put in. If you've ever got your password wrong a couple of times on Twitter, you'll start to get a captcha appearing. start to prove that you're a human, not a robot logging in. So that's quite a common technique to try and slow down the login process. But of course, you can't put a captcha on an API because it's a machine talking to a machine. So you can't have that interpreting a captcha because that's a ridiculous idea. That's not going to work. Two-factor authentication. It's a great way of securing websites and securing applications, especially things now with Google Authenticator and some of the free stuff that's out there. But again, it doesn't work on an API because an API is meant to be from machine to machine. So we can't use two-factor authentication. Certificates. You could use certificates. I can see a lot of people shaking their heads. Yeah, absolute nightmare to manage and only really work when it's the end user doing their own application in. If you're starting to use an API from cloud to cloud or start with affiliate services connecting in and not just client applications, it doesn't work. You need it's too complicated. It just doesn't work with those kind of scenarios. 3 strikes and you're out. This is the fairly obvious one to say with any authentication process. If you get it wrong 3 times, we'll lock your account. You'll have to get sent an email. You'll have to go and reset it. Okay, fair enough. That would work. Yeah. But it would also be an awesome denial of service attack. Because all you'd have to do, using an API with a nice bank of machines all set up to do it, give them a list of usernames, and they'd just lock out nearly every account within iCloud. So you could start blackmailing people by locking their account out on a daily basis. So 3 strikes and you're out doesn't work. It would work if you could measure every login to the API globally. Now, if you've got one application on one server, 3 strikes and you're out might work. The challenge Apple have got is they've got thousands of entry points, thousands of servers all over the world. So being able to do failed login frequency monitoring, as it's called, lovely title, you try doing that globally. You try synchronizing every failed login attempt onto every server on a global basis to know that you've had so many in the last hour to lock out an account. Incredibly difficult to do, incredibly difficult. So the bottom line is that Apple didn't do any of this. They just didn't bother. They just let the API, if you get authentication wrong, you don't get in. You can try again, and you can try again, and you can try again. One of the challenges with the whole failed login frequency is some of the apps that were written to use iCloud, if you did put your password in wrong, especially on your phone, it would just keep trying again and again and again. So that frequency monitoring would be constantly being hit. So you couldn't really protect from it. The bottom line here is APIs are a hacker's dream. They get the ability to do good old-fashioned brute forcing. Something ironically that we've seen more recently in a couple of security surveys, that brute forcing is starting to fall off the attacker's sort of matrix list. They're going for more just stealing passwords and scraping passwords now. But a warning, APIs are a hacker's dream. I didn't put another one on there. I know time's running out. So just to balance out that lovely shot of Terry Childs, just to go to the other end of the scale, I'm also going to just very quickly show, this is a girl, 21-year-old Russian girl, Christina, nicknamed the world's most glamorous hacker. She was part of a $22 million cyber scam that involved a certain amount of social engineering as well as stealing from bank accounts, and you'll see how she managed that in a second. And rumours have it that in one transaction, you can see I had to lay out my slides a bit funny here, the part of the alleged court case had details of one single transaction from one victim that was a $3 million transfer in one transaction. So this isn't just penny pinching out of accounts or trying to do things under the radar. This was a one-hit glory steal. And that's her, the world's most glamorous hacker. 21-year-old arrested, and that was about 4 years ago, and I think the court case is still going on. So it's not fully finished yet. So yes, I have named her, and she might not be guilty, but it's a nice picture anyway. And if I had time, I was going to go on to a last slide, and I was going to talk about a story that I was involved with investigating, but it's nowhere near as glamorous as these. So I think we're probably, where is he? Are we good for time?
Yeah, we're all right. Okay.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Right, this was nowhere near as exciting. And you'll get what this slide means in a minute. So I was involved in an investigation a few years ago of an oil and gas research company where one of their board members suddenly found unread emails in their mailbox that weren't being sent to them, that were sent between other board members, slating them and talking about how they were going to push them off the board and how they were going to change the structure of the company. So the guy was slightly alarmed at finding this, and he brought us in, and I kind of led an investigation to try and work out what was going on. And the first thing we discovered was when you open up Outlook, as an administrator, you can log into Outlook using different accounts. You can use what's called Run As, and you can run different windows. You can have 2 Outlook windows on the screen, and you can drag and drop an email from one window to the other, and it will move from one mailbox to the other. Just like you're dragging and dropping files between folders, you can drag and move emails. Trust me, I've tried it. It works. Yeah. Go on.
What is the stated benefit of doing that?
There isn't. In fact, it's really bad, or it was when I get to the end of this story. So yeah, it's just an object within Windows, and it copies it using the clipboard buffer, and it will just move it from one to the other as if it's copying a message. As if you're dragging it to another folder within your own Outlook. If you've got 2 open, you can drag one from the other. Now, the theory was that somebody within the organization had done this accidentally. They'd been a bit of a, what we term, sysadmin voyeur, and they'd been poking around and reading the VIP's mailboxes. It was bored, so they had to poke around. And at some point, they'd accidentally dragged an email across. And that's how it appeared, unread, not even sent to the right person in this other mailbox. So we couldn't quite trace that because there wasn't enough logging on within the environment in the network at the time. So we turned up a whole load of logging. So we had millions and millions of lines of logs to try and trawl through, which was a nightmare in itself. And as we were looking through, and we're trying to look for patterns, we're trying to work out what's going on. And we couldn't find anything. There was no unapproved account access. There was no cross-account access to mailboxes. There was nothing there that was any different than what was allowed to happen already. So we started looking into what was allowed to happen. So admin accounts that had full access to the mailboxes, various different roles on it. This was around about the time where backup technology had just evolved, and you could get what they called mailbox level backups. So previously, Exchange was backed up as just one big blob, but the products had evolved, and there were a few backup solutions, one of which the organization had just deployed, which was capable of backing up individual mails from individual mailboxes. And it did this with an agent running on the machine that ran as a service account. And that service account was called Exchange. Fairly generic account. They used it for the backups as well as for running the mail server. And as we're trawling through these logs, we're looking through trying to find any kind of odd access and anything that's going on that was out of the ordinary. Couldn't see anything. We were seeing at 2 o'clock in the morning, the backups were happening and the Exchange account was accessing it. And we were seeing it from a couple of different servers because there were different backup agents around the place. It all looked perfectly normal until one line in one of the logs had Exchange as the account accessing a mailbox, and it happened to be one of the VIP's mailboxes, but it had a lowercase e at the start. And all the rest of the Exchange accounts that were doing the backups had a capital E. So we went and looked on the servers that were having the backups run, and we looked up the backup agents, and lo and behold, the Exchange account on all those backup agents was with a capital E. But there's this one log entry with a lowercase e. We then looked up that IP address and found that wasn't one of the servers. That was an admin's workstation in the US. In fact, it wasn't. It was a server in the US that an admin had been RDPing onto to try and cover his tracks, but that didn't stop us. So what we discovered that he was logging on to a server, opening up Outlook, logging on as this Exchange account, which had access to everything. He was doing it US time during the day, which coincided with the backups in the UK, so it wouldn't get seen in logs. So he was doing a lot to try and cover his trails, but he was typing a lowercase e for the name of the account. We then set a few traps. We managed to put some logging in place to get into a bit more detail, actually trapped the actual guy doing it. Yes, he was just reading through all the mailboxes of all the VIPs and all the board members. And within about 24 hours of us discovering all this, he was sat down in HR and subsequently fired. And that was the first person I've been responsible for firing. There have been a couple of others, but that was the first. That was the first one that resulted in a direct dismissal of somebody for being a bit of a voyeur around admin accounts. Yeah, so that's the importance of a capital E and a small e on an account name. One character, simple as that. Thank you. I think we're out of time now. Any questions? I can see one coming. Go on then.
Yeah, why did you jump to sysadmin's tinkering? Because I could arrange for a similar thing to appear in your inbox. Just knowing a mail address.
Yes, but when it's an internal message, it's a darn sight harder to spoof. So spoofing a message when it's an internal message within inside the organisation, and this message was real. It was a genuine mail that when this board member confronted the others, they went, "How the hell did you see that email?" You know, it was an immediate, yes, that was a real email, but how did you know about it? And that's what sparked the investigation to, okay, putting aside what you're actually talking about and slating me, how the hell did this get in my email box? And that's what then triggered the whole investigation. And it was because the guy was using the account to access multiple mailboxes at the same time, and at some point he must have just accidentally drag and dropped a message and not even realised he'd done it across 2 Outlook windows. And it was when we were looking into the Outlook that we found that you can actually do that, and it works absolutely fine. Yeah. Go on.
Considering the level at which the attempt to find himself, like IPing to a server and then creating an account at the same time as the backups are going on, so that things actually seen. How did they miss? You know, was quite clearly a different name for an account essentially.
They missed it because in Windows, account names are case insensitive. So you can log on perfectly well with lowercase e exchange as well as capital E exchange. Both will work and both will log on fine. So there were no audit failures in any logs. There was nobody failing to log on. So he hadn't been brute forcing it. It turned out he was part of the project that installed the backup software. So he knew the password to this all-encompassing exchange account. So he already knew the password, and he knew if he used that account, it wouldn't get flagged. It wasn't his. It wasn't going to be traceable to him. He just logged in with that account. He just happened to type a lowercase e when he logged in with it, rather than an uppercase. If he'd have typed an uppercase e, we'd have probably worked it out eventually, but it would have been a darn sight harder. We'd have had to have gone through every address and mapped the entire network. So we'd have got there in the end, but that was the telltale sign.
So the audit log records the username you typed in rather than the user ID?
Correct. Because it's case insensitive, it doesn't care.
But why record the string, not the ID?
It's the way Windows works. So when Windows...
Badly.
Yep. A little thing you can try, if you've got a standalone Windows server that's not in a domain, normally when you log into a Windows box, you can put domain/username. When you log into a workstation, you put the host name of the workstation /username. Try typing codpiece/username to a standalone workstation, and it will log you in. Standalone workstation does not care what you put before the slash, because you can only log in locally. So it literally doesn't care. And anything you do, it will log your username as codpiece/your username. And when you lock the machine, it will say, this machine can only be unlocked by codpiece/username or an administrator. It just blindly puts it up as what's been typed in. One of the foibles of Windows, I'm afraid.
At the end of the day, the guy legitimately had the passwords because he was involved in installing software.
Yep.
So, okay, he got caught, but surely every company that installs this software, somebody's got to know that password. So, how do you stop this happening?
What you need is a product called Osirium, which happens to be who I work for. No.
Also don't hire Terry Challenge.
Yeah, it's true. And that's one of those problems, is that when admins know generic account passwords, yes, they need to set it up and set that password for it, but unless something comes along and changes it to something people don't know, the organisation has the risk that that password can be used for other purposes. And in this case, exactly as he did. He knew that password, he knew it was untraceable, he knew to the most part he'd get away with it, and he almost did. So that's what led him to give it a go and have a try at doing what he did. But yeah, obviously reading somebody else's mailbox is well outside of his IT duties, even if he does know an account that has the rights to do it. So it was still outside of his employment contract, if you like.
I guess that's the whole inside effect situation.
Yep.
How do we effectively, without coming and setting up for consultants to work for us full time and buy their software, is there any the external threat is relatively, I say,
Yep.
easy, but there's a lot of tools about and have been for donkey's years to
Yep.
monitor that. The insider threat,
Yep.
what's your approach to that?
So protecting from insider threat is really, really easy. All you have to do is make sure that every account that's generic, that every admin knows, you know who knows it, you change that to a long, complicated password on a regular basis, don't share it with anybody, and lock it away in a safe. Do that every 30 days. Then you're absolutely fine. But that's a lot of work. A lot of work.
Anything does happen, they know it's you.
Yeah, and it's what we term Password Sunday.
So it would have been all safe so that you know who's been in there.
Yeah, yeah. So it's what we call Password Sunday. A lot of organisations, second Sunday of every month, they will change all of their passwords on all of their service accounts, but the person who's changing it still knows what that password is. So you're still down to, even if it's just one person, it's a lot of work for one person, but you're narrowing it down. And that's Password Sunday. And then you have what's called Hangover Monday, which is then when you find all of the systems where you got it wrong, or you missed, or you didn't copy that guy the password for the work he needed to do, so he then couldn't get in and got locked out. And if we've had this with a major international bank that had a service account within Active Directory and 1,000 servers using a service account. Somebody went onto one of those servers and was fiddling about with one of the backup services, and at some point they had to re-enter the password. They got it wrong, the password they entered, but it saved it quite happily on that service. That machine, then when it tried to log in and do a backup, logged in 3 times, locked out the account. Then 1,000 other servers couldn't log in and do backups. But because 1,000 other servers couldn't log in, the audit trails just had masses of lists of 1,000 servers with log on failure. They couldn't work out which one had caused it in the first place. They had to go through each server one at a time to find the one where the password had been typed wrong. But you can't see the passwords. So you have to go through each one, typing it back in correctly to match what it was already in AD. It took them 3 weeks to recover 1,000 servers. And that was 3 weeks of not having backups of those servers. And this was a major, major international bank. Screwed over because one password was typed in wrong.
They couldn't
Yeah.
just restore from the backup.
You'd have thought that would have been the clever way of doing it, yeah. But because it was the backup that was screwed, the backup agent was needed to do the recovery. But a bit of catch-22 going on. But yeah, that was yeah, quite an amusing incident. Yeah. Yeah. That was the mistake they made, is they left it as an account that could be blocked, which you shouldn't do for service accounts, absolutely. And what you need is a piece of software that makes sure service accounts are handled separately and locked down. I'll have a look for you and I'll let you know afterwards, yeah? We might be able to do that, yeah. Yeah, I'm sure we can have a look, yeah. Yep.
The setting so it doesn't block it, and then I'm
Yeah, but then as soon as that one server that had it wrong tried to log in again,
if you remove the setting, which I can't remember, but if you say this,
Yeah.
don't disable this account, and then unlock it, when that server logs in, it can't lock the account now.
correct? And effectively what they did, and they then went through a process of having to change all the passwords on all the servers, but they're all live servers under change control, and that's what took them 3 weeks. So I don't know the entire recovery plan, but when we went to talk to them, they were like, this is what happened, can you help? And when we stopped laughing, we said, yes, absolutely we can help. And by the way, that's now one of my great stories to tell people. So yeah, there are going to be ways and steps to go through it. But you know, in a large bank like that, you're talking about servers in multiple countries. You're changing AD, which is under very strict control. 1,000 servers to say, right, we're going to do something to that account, which is now going to affect 1,000 servers again. You know, there's a lot of implications of all of that. So it's, it's challenging. Yeah. Sorry, there's one down here.
Just an observation really for me that yes, you lock down and you put the process in place to manage the internal level, but because there's more and more people moving on to the cloud, like Microsoft, Apple, Google,
Yep.
and all these online services, it shows the amount of trust that corporations in general
Yep.
have in these organisations in management
Yep.
and stopping
Mm.
some instances happening.
Yeah. Well, I go into major banks and I talk about Jennifer Lawrence.
Yeah.
And they're looking at me going, why? And you say, well, if you're using a cloud service and you've got IP and you've got some of your corporate data up in the cloud and you're trusting your admins to use a password, how strong is that password? Could it be guessed by that brute force style attack that happened to her account? Could that be your IP that gets revealed rather than her photos, which I think was a pure fluke that they happened to be there anyway. But turning that into the corporate world, yes, that's one of the big trust decisions in the cloud. You know, we may all trust it with our photos-ish, but getting corporates to trust it, you know, most people trust it with their email, but now they're starting to look at source code and IP and, you know, some of the bigger, more business critical stuff. It just goes to show the challenges, yeah. Cool. Thank you very much.